My name is Maura Policelli. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Keough School of Global Affairs. We're pleased to have you with us this morning. This is the first public event for the Keough School, which is representing the University of Notre Dame as the headquarters for the university here in Washington. So thank you for being with us. So I have the honor of introducing Dean Appleby, who will be kicking off our event this morning. He is the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, which is a brand new school, the first school at the University of Notre Dame in about 100 years. So it's a big endeavor that he is leading. He is a graduate of Notre Dame, and he earned his master's degree and doctoral degrees in history at the University of Chicago. He's been a member of the Notre Dame faculty since 1994. His research and teaching has focused on religious and intellectual history, global religious movements, and international peace studies. And he is a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. I'm honored to work for him at the Keough School, and he's made the trip from South Bend to welcome us this morning. So Dean Appleby.
Good morning to everyone, and welcome to this first public event at our new office here, the Keough School of Global Affairs office in Washington, D.C., which will also be a convening place for the University of Notre Dame more generally, and for all of you, we hope. We couldn't think of a better event to inaugurate this office and have an opening public event, because we're celebrating two things dear to the heart of the Keough School and to Notre Dame: Ireland and peace building. Our association with Ireland goes back, well, at least to 1842, when the University of Notre Dame was founded by a French priest named Father Sorin. But when he went to Notre Dame, he brought with him 4 Irish brothers, and then the rest is history. That was in 1842. And then very quickly, Irish immigrants who were flocking to America at the time came to the University of Notre Dame. I'll call it a university at this point with hyperbole. And in the next episode of Celebrating Ireland was when one of the presidents of Notre Dame, Father William Corby, who was president twice during from 1860s to the 1880s, was the chaplain, the U.S. chaplain, to the Irish Brigade in the Civil War. And there's a statue at Notre Dame, which of course the students call Fair Catch Corby, if you know football. But it's a statue of Father Corby blessing the Union troops on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, giving them absolution in advance of the slaughter they're about to conduct. And they, after that moment, became the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. So the story has gone on for now 175 years, and Notre Dame has become a leading center through the Keough Naughton Institute for Irish Studies of Ireland. And we have done a great deal of work and research in Ireland more generally, and in Northern Ireland, especially with peace accords. I'm delighted that I'm joined today by our colleague, Professor Robert Shmuel. Bob is a professor of American Studies and Journalism at Notre Dame, and also one of our experts on Ireland, especially on the Easter Rising. So we're delighted that Bob is with us. I also want to welcome and be delighted that we are here with our partner in this hosting, Ambassador Daniel Mulhall, who is here with us, Mulhall. And Ambassador Mulhall was on campus this past April and delivered a lecture on Belfast, Brexit, and beyond. How will Brexit affect politics and peace in Northern Ireland? And we had to have an overflow room. It was such a popular lecture, and our students are so interested, and faculty. And Ambassador Mulhall did a great job. We're delighted that we're joining you in hosting this event, Ambassador Mulhall. The other topic that we're discussing today, not only Ireland, but peace building. And Northern Ireland, of course, comes to mind, but so too, for Notre Dame, in a very special way, Colombia. Notre Dame has been engaged in peace building efforts for decades now, primarily through the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which is a unit of the Keough School, and a number of colleagues there who have worked on peace accords. Some 15 years ago, we recognized a research challenge was, what do we do about the fact that 46% of peace accords signed around the world fail within 5 years? How do we explain that? That settlements just don't seem to work. So at Notre Dame, we set about looking at all the comprehensive peace agreements since the end of the Cold War and coding them with some researchers and examining and comparing their implementation. And the obvious headline is, why don't they work? A lot of the provisions aren't implemented. Why not? And which ones are implemented successfully and which not? So this project is called PAM, the Peace Accords Matrix. And the leader of that project, a colleague of mine at Notre Dame, is with us today, David Cortright, who will be on the panel you'll hear from in a few moments. This is really the first time a university-based research center has played a direct role, in this case, in overseeing the implementation of the Colombian peace accords. And it's the first time researchers have measured the implementation of a peace accord in real time. It's a very exciting project, and you'll hear about it in a moment. We're delighted that David, who's just returned from Bogota and is about to submit the next report to the Colombian government, to other stakeholders, is here from Colombia. This is the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It's the second anniversary of the peace accords in Colombia. They're at different stages. They both continue to need support and hard work to be sustained. So we're here to talk about those connections and to share knowledge about that, those efforts for peace. This is really central to the mission of the Keough School of Global Affairs. Before I turn the lectern over to Ambassador Mulhall, I want to recognize three distinguished guests. First of all, we have with us Bob Costa, who is a member of the Keough School Advisory Council. By virtue of Bob being here, he's representing the council. He may not know that, but we're delighted that Bob, who works with the Washington Post and is an important communicator here in D.C. and beyond nationally, is with us. Ambassador Joe Mcmanus has had a distinguished career as an American diplomat for over 30 years. Joe is a Notre Dame grad, a great friend of the university. He's currently the nominee to become the U.S. ambassador to Colombia. Also with us is Ambassador David Donohue, who has represented the government in Ireland around the world for many years, most recently at the United Nations. He also visited the Keough School on campus last fall, spoke with our students, did a terrific job, made a great impression upon those students. So thank you all for being here. We're going to have an exciting program this morning. With that, let me turn the podium over to Ambassador Mulhall.
Thank you, Dean Appleby, for those introductory remarks. It's a real pleasure and privilege for our embassy to act as joint hosts for this event. When Hilary Riley, my colleague at the embassy, who deserves great credit for the work she's done in putting this event together, came to me and said, what about hosting an event jointly with Notre Dame? I took about 2 seconds to say, of course we must do that. Why? How could we possibly have any doubts about the Irish Embassy working together with the University of Notre Dame? At that time, by the way, I hadn't been to Notre Dame, so I hadn't seen for myself the actual reality of the University of Notre Dame. But when I did go there, I was overwhelmed by the Irishness of the university. In fact, when you arrive at South Bend Airport, over the public address system, you're welcomed by a coach of one of the many sporting teams of the university. And certainly when I was passing through, it was the ladies' basketball coach who finished her greeting by saying, "Go Irish." So any place where people greet you with a reference to Ireland has to be a place well worth visiting. And I look forward to going back and seeing Touchdown Jesus in action at some stage in the coming months to see the great football team. I've seen them play in Croke Park, but I think I have to go and see them play at Notre Dame as well. So it is really a pleasure for us to be here. when I was in Notre Dame, I was walking through the main building to see the president, Father Jenkins. I noticed that apart from the first president, who is a French priest, all the other presidents of the university going back to the 19th century all seem to have good Irish names and good Irish backgrounds. So the French may have started it, but the Irish soon, I think, took it over and made it their own. And certainly I felt very much at home there anyway. It's great to be the first organization to cooperate with the university in its new campus here, new Washington campus. And I thank Maria Policelli for working with Hilary Riley to make this a reality today. It's great to have such distinguished panelists, especially Eamon Gilmore, who I'll speak about in a moment, but also, of course, my colleague, the Ambassador of Colombia, Ambassador Reyes, Norman Houston, who was awarded an OBE last week, richly deserved recognition for his contribution to promoting Northern Ireland here in the United States and Canada. Barbara Stephenson from the Foreign Service Association, Professor David Cortright from the Kroc Institute. It's great to have him here, and because of the Institute's role in monitoring the peace process. And of course, our moderator, Amanda Sloat, whom I've known for more than 20 years, because we first met when I was the Irish Consul General in Edinburgh, and Amanda was a graduate student at the time, studying for a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. So it's good to connect again with Amanda here in Washington, D.C. Wonderful also to have my distinguished colleague, the former UN Ambassador David Donohue. David and I go back 40 years. We've served in the Irish Foreign Service for 4 decades, and it's great to have him here this morning as well. Now, recently I've been marking the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. I've taken part in events all over the country, including in Notre Dame. And we were able to mark 20 years of peace. But reconciliation remains a work in progress. And we continue to have hurdles that we have to get around and find solutions to problems that arise. And currently, of course, there's a political impasse in Northern Ireland, and the Irish government, as a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, is working hard, determined to find a way of bringing the institutions back into action again, because that's an essential ingredient for giving effect to the Good Friday Agreement. We also, of course, have the complication brought about by Britain's decision to leave the European Union, which of course has introduced a further complexity into an already complex situation in Northern Ireland. I was present in Belfast on the 10th of April 1998. I was at that time the press spokesman for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, and but that event, that day, I now realise, and I realised then, was the culmination of a quarter century of effort on the part of various people to try and bring that peace agreement about. Colleagues of mine in the Department of Foreign Affairs had laboured away for 25 years since the Sunningdale Agreement of 1973. And it all came together in 1998. And there were many elements involved in bringing that peace agreement about. Included was the fact that after a generation of conflict, there was, I think, a weariness in Northern Ireland and a desire on the part of the public in Northern Ireland, whether they were Unionists or Nationalists, to find some way forward out of the impasse. The two governments had developed a broadly shared analysis of the problem and of its potential solution. That was not something that came about overnight. It was helped greatly by the fact that we were both members of the European Union. But we did eventually create a common analysis, and were able to move forward on that basis. We were very fortunate to have such wonderful international support, notably from the United States and the European Union. Successive American presidents, stretching back to Jimmy Carter, had taken a positive, supportive interest in Northern Ireland. We also had steady support from Congress, from Speaker O'Neill in his day, and from members of the Friends of Ireland, who are still active today in supporting the cause of peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Of course, we were very fortunate as well that President Bill Clinton decided to nominate the gifted Senator George Mitchell, who played an enormously positive role in pushing the agreement over the line. And he showed the kind of patience and persistence that I think every peace process requires. So I think it's appropriate, 20 years on, to reflect on the international dimension of our peace process, because it did have an international dimension, European and American, and to reflect on the lessons that might be learnt from our experience in Ireland. I accept fully, that each conflict is unique and there is no formula for peacemaking. However, Northern Ireland does offer the example of a successful peace process, and that surely means that it's worth examining to see if there are elements that may be relevant to other processes, including the process that's underway in Colombia. We in Ireland understand the difficult and painful choices that peace and reconciliation can entail. And we were grateful for the support that came to us at critical junctures on the road to peace. And for this reason, our government has been more than pleased to support Colombia in its ongoing peace journey. Our government has contributed some $15 million over the last number of years in support of peace in Colombia. Last year, $3 million were provided in funding to Colombia to support the implementation of the peace agreement, to support human rights, as well as to develop lesson-sharing programs between Colombia and Ireland, focusing on human rights, the role of women in peace, prisoner reintegration, political participation, and so forth. In other words, we don't claim to have all the answers, but true peace and reconciliation has to remain a work in progress. It remains that in Northern Ireland and will remain in that condition in Colombia for years to come. But I think solidarity is important, and the Colombian people can count on continued solidarity and support from Ireland as they seek to implement their agreement. We've had many bumps along the road to peace, but the main thing is to remain on that road. Ireland is also a founding signatory to the EU Trust Fund for Colombia and one of the 7 donor countries to the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund for Colombia. We've also seconded a technical expert to the Colombian Ministry of Post-Conflict to support their work on post-conflict implementation. And we have also seconded a national expert from Ireland to the EU delegation in Bogota to support the work being done by Eamon Gilmore. So lesson sharing and lesson learning are intertwined and mutually supportive. We can also learn from Colombia's experiences. Every peace process learns from what has gone before, but they're only successful if they respond to their own particular challenges, context, and situation. I'm delighted to have the pleasure to introduce Eamon Gilmore, who will deliver keynote remarks. I'm honoured to introduce Eamon. Eamon and I go back to the 1970s when we were both students involved in student politics. Eamon was far more distinguished in student politics in those days and went on to have one of the most important careers in Irish politics of the past generation and more. So, but he and I, remember those days in the 70s when Ireland was a very different country indeed, and where peace seemed like a dim prospect, given what was happening in Northern Ireland in those days. So, Eamon, of course, went on to become the leader of his party, the Labour Party, went on to become our Minister of Foreign Affairs and our Deputy Prime Minister, and it was my privilege to serve him in that capacity when I was ambassador in London. And indeed, Eamon Gilmore was the foreign minister at the time of the historic first Irish state visit to the United Kingdom. Believe it or not, for 90 years after Irish independence, our president did not make a state visit to the United Kingdom because of the legacy created by our history and by the conflict in Northern Ireland. And that visit that was paid by our president in 2014, which Eamon Gilmore and I had the privilege of being involved in, was something that was also a legacy of peace in Ireland, because it made normal relations between Britain and Ireland possible again after so many decades of tensions surrounding the situation in Northern Ireland. While serving as Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ireland, Eamon managed the Northern Ireland peace process on behalf of the Irish government at a crucial time. He also oversaw and renewed our development aid programme and our active engagement with the 70 million members of the Irish diaspora around the world, many of whom are graduates of Notre Dame University, you'll be happy to know. Eamon was named in 2015 by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the top 100 leading global thinkers because of his role in championing marriage equality in Ireland. In November 2015, Eamon was appointed European Union Special Envoy for the peace process in Colombia, where he works with the Colombian and EU stakeholders to support the peace process, especially in the implementation phase. He was recently conferred with an honorary doctorate in laws by his alma mater, the National University of Ireland, Galway, and he's been awarded a Légion d'honneur by the government of France. So please join me in welcoming to the stage to say a few words, Eamon Gilmore, EU Envoy to the Colombian peace process. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Dean Appleby, Ambassador Mulhall, thank you for your very, very kind words. Ambassador of Colombia, Camilo Reyes, Ambassador Stephenson, Ambassador David Donohue, Ambassador Mcmanus. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Mcmanus, the European Union delegation, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be here at the we say Keough, we don't say Keough, we say Keough, the Keough School of Global Policy. I had the honour of knowing Keough. I sat with him when Notre Dame, the Notre Dame team played Navy in Dublin and won. I suppose there's something ironic about speaking on the theme of peace in the University of the Fighting Irish. I also had the privilege of presenting Keough with the Presidential Award, Irish Presidential Award, for his service to the Irish diaspora and his service to Ireland, because he was indeed not just a great friend of Notre Dame University, but a great friend also of Ireland. And the connection with Notre Dame University and my work today continues because, of course, I have the privilege of working with the Kroc Institute, who have been asked to monitor the implementation of the Colombian peace agreement, and they've developed the matrix which enables them to do that, and it's a great privilege to work with your people, Professor, in Bogota, and I must say they're doing a great job, and I'm looking forward to receiving the next briefing from them. This week, exactly 2 months ago, I was in Belfast for the events to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. I was in the Ulster Hall when President Bill Clinton and Senator George Mitchell deservedly received the Freedom of the City from Belfast City Council. I attended many events in the City Hall, in Queen's University, in the Titanic Centre, in the Lyric Theatre. But my memory of that week, commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, was not about the big events which were organised, and they were indeed memorable. And the speeches which were made and the reunion of the men and women who made the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement was quite remarkable and quite inspiring. My memory of that week was simply walking around the city of Belfast. My hotel, the Malmaison Hotel, was in the centre of the city. And walking around what is now kind of modern city that you see anywhere in Europe or in the United States, probably a bit more European because I think more of it is pedestrianised, people going about their daily business. And I remember what that city centre was like 20, 30 years ago, before the peace agreement was made, when if you wanted to walk through the streets of the city of Belfast, you went through an army turnstile. The soldier searched your bag if you had one, and you had to share this experience of anticipation, of apprehension that people in a city in conflict have to share. And that week when we were in Belfast, of course, we all reflected on the fact that not all is well, that the key institutions established by the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive, have not met since the beginning of 2017. But as I walked around that city, and I'm sure it was an experience that others shared, I thought of friends who had lost their lives in the Northern Ireland conflict. I thought of the thousands of people who were killed during that 30 years of fighting, the tens of thousands who were injured, and the hundreds of thousands whose lives have been affected because they are victims of the conflict. And I think there are two lessons that I draw from that and which help to inspire the work that I do in Colombia. And the first is that no matter how imperfect the peace, no matter what the difficulties are, there are thousands of people alive today who would be in their graves if we had not made the Good Friday Agreement. That the making of peace, even imperfect peace, saves lives and builds a better life for all. And secondly, that the difficulties and challenges that are in every peace process, the difficulties we now have 20 years later in Northern Ireland, the many setbacks that we had over the years, and I remember distinctly, for example, the bomb in Omagh, which went off just within months of the signing of the agreement. The importance of persistence and patience and staying with it and making it work. So I have the privilege of having worked on the Northern Ireland peace process, as Ambassador Mulhall has said, of working now on behalf of the European Union on the Colombian peace process. 3 years ago, Federica Mogherini, the European Union High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security, asked me to come to Brussels, and she said it was her intention to appoint a special envoy to support the peace process in Colombia. And she asked me if I would undertake that task, and in doing so, she referenced my knowledge of the peace process in Northern Ireland. The two conflicts are very different. Different in origin, context, in their scale, and indeed in their content. But despite those differences, every day in my work in Colombia, there is some experience from the peace process in Northern Ireland that I draw on. I drew on it on my last mission to Colombia, when I visited a leader of FARC who was on hunger strike, because I know the dynamic of hunger strikes from the experience of Northern Ireland. I know when FARC representatives talk to me about their wish to see remaining prisoners released, I know how important that is to them, because I've seen that also in Northern Ireland. When I talk with opponents of the peace agreement, I understand how they feel about aspects of the transitional justice arrangements, because I heard people in my own country telling me how uncomfortable they were with the release after 2 years sentence of IRA prisoners. When I meet with local communities, as I did, for example, recently in Choco, and I meet people doing wonderful work and mobilizing communities to demand peace, I think of the work that was done by civil society in Northern Ireland. And even on the night that the peace agreement was defeated in a plebiscite, I could recall referenda in my own country where they were unexpectedly defeated. So what are the lessons that can be drawn from the experience of Northern Ireland and the parallels in Colombia? And drawing those two together, what are those lessons that we can apply in thinking about strategies for lasting peace accords elsewhere? I think the first word of caution that I would express is that every conflict is different, and that we need to be careful about simply transposing the solutions of one to another. Jean Arnaud, great French diplomat, who now leads the United Nations mission in Colombia, I remember him saying, he said, the worst thing any of us can do here is to believe that we have seen it all before. And with that word of caution, I just want to identify 6 areas where I think there are important lessons to be learned. There are others, but I have 15 minutes and I'm going to confine it to 6. The first is, how and when do you start a talks process? It doesn't happen, as Ambassador Mulhall says, by the President of Colombia picking up the phone and deciding someday that he's going to ring the leader of FARC. There has to be a lot of preparation, a lot of informal discussion, a lot of back-channel discussion, using in many cases mediators from churches, from NGOs, from international actors. Jonathan Powell, in his book Talking to Terrorists, traces the initial contacts by the United Kingdom government with the IRA back to the early 1970s. But they weren't the only contacts. There was the discussions between John Hume and Gerry Adams, which were described as the Hume-Adams talks, the work of people like Father Alec Reid, who acted as a mediator, the work of Irish diplomats like David Donohue here, Ambassador Donohue, who worked for many years in talking with different actors and different interests in Northern Ireland, patiently building up the grounds for a peace discussion. There was the contribution of the Irish diaspora, particularly here in the United States, and the work that the Irish Embassy here in Washington did in working with the Irish diaspora, in encouraging those who were engaged in violence to stop and to take the road of peace. And there was the important work, which I think is sometimes overlooked in peace processes, of civil society, of organisations on the ground, organisations in Northern Ireland, throughout Ireland, who at different times came forward to demand on behalf of the population that those who were engaged in violence should cease, that governments should talk to those who were engaged in the violence, and that there should be a peace agreement. The same in many ways happened in Colombia. Every president of Colombia since 1980 made some effort to try and bring an end to the conflict. When President Santos commenced his term in 2010, there were 2 years of back-channel discussions with FARC before any formal negotiations took place. Those back-channel discussions agreed the 6 points of the Colombian agenda, which formed the basis of the talks in Havana. Sometimes those early discussions don't work. We saw that in Northern Ireland. The Sunningdale Agreement in 1973, the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985. Similarly with Colombia, for example, the agreement that was reached in the mid-1980s, which led to the formation of the Union Patriotica political party, thousands of whose members were subsequently murdered. You know, at the time, people see these as failures. But in fact, although they were seen that way at the time, they also laid the basis for the successful talks which later took place. So if we are thinking about how these lessons apply to other conflict situations, I think we have to recognize that if we look at any of the conflicts which are taking place around the world today, if we want to end up with a negotiated settlement of these conflicts, somebody has to be talking to people that maybe governments might regard now as being unacceptable or unpalatable to talk with. It's understandable, of course, that governments may not be able to talk with those who are engaged in the terrorist activity. But it is important that somebody is doing it, whether it is people in churches, in peace institutes, in universities, in civil society organizations, or in international bodies. The second area that I think that there are lessons to be learned is in the conduct of the negotiations. Let me just instance three questions that perhaps we might think about. The first is, should you have a ceasefire or not before talks begin? In the case of Northern Ireland, the Government of Ireland and the Government of the United Kingdom insisted that the IRA is on a ceasefire and that the loyalist paramilitary organisations were on a ceasefire before discussions could take place. And when the IRA broke that ceasefire by planting bombs in the financial centre of London in 1996, the talks were ended and did not resume again until the ceasefire was reinstated. In Colombia, there was no formal ceasefire with FARC, in fact, until June of 2016, 2 months before the final agreement was eventually made. And today, there is no formal ceasefire with the ELN, although negotiations are taking place with them in Havana. However, I do have to say that in the case of Colombia, although there wasn't a formal ceasefire, there was, however, a very significant de-escalation of the violence. The second question is, should the discussions, to what extent should they be conducted in public or in private? In Northern Ireland, the talks which took place in Stormont, the talks themselves were not public, but every day as the participants went in to meet The cameras and the microphones were there, and they talked about what they were going to talk about, and then when on their way out, they talked about what they had talked about. And although the cameras were not in the room, the public had an opportunity of being conditioned, if you like, for the compromises which would have to be made in the reaching of a final agreement. In the case of Colombia, it was different. Of necessity, the talks couldn't take place in Bogota. The talks took place in Havana. It wouldn't have worked if they had not taken place in Cuba. And I want to pay tribute to the role that the government of Cuba and the government of Norway played in acting as guarantor countries for those talks. But the talks took place much more in private, and therefore the public were only introduced to outcomes from the talks at different points through joint communiques, and sometimes were surprised by the compromises that had to be made. And I think it is a question to what extent that contributed to the eventual outcome in the plebiscite. Third issue is the length of the agreement, or the detail of the agreement. Colombian agreement is the most detailed and most comprehensive peace agreement anywhere, certainly in the 21st century. It's 300 pages, 6 different chapters. The Northern Ireland Agreement was much shorter, but had to be supplemented by subsequent agreements which were made afterwards, addressing issues that were not in the detail of the original agreement. A third area where I think there are parallels is in the involvement of women. If there is one lesson, I think, to be drawn from the experience of both peace processes, it's that you cannot make a peace agreement without the involvement of women in the design of the peace agreement, in the negotiation of the peace agreement, and in its implementation. I remember in Northern Ireland at the time the peace talks, there were hardly any women on the political horizon, certainly at a leadership level in Northern Ireland, certainly no women in the leadership of the armed organisations that were conducting the campaign. And then we had the late Mo Mowlam, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. We had Monica McWilliams, who founded the Women's Coalition Party, and who incidentally has been to Colombia on a number of occasions, sharing her experience of her work. People like Bríd Rogers of the SDLP and Liz O'Donnell, who was Minister of State in the Irish government. Similarly, in Colombia, there was a dedicated gender subcommission which addressed gender issues and which overlaid the entire agreement. And indeed, ironically, one of the controversies which arose in the course of the plebiscite was related to some of the content of that work. Interestingly enough, compared to where Northern Ireland started out with women's participation, you look at it now, 3 of the 5 main parties in Northern Ireland are led by women today. The Secretary of State of Northern Ireland is a woman. And if the parties in Northern Ireland ever manage to get the executive back up and running again, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister will both be women. The fourth area where I think there are lessons to be drawn is on the issue of victims. When you think about it, peace agreements are essentially negotiated between the actors in the conflict, between the perpetrators, really. The victims, in many cases, are dead. Their families and friends are still suffering. Looking at the 2 agreements in Northern Ireland, I think the issue of victims and issues relating to the past at the stage of the Good Friday Agreement was left to be dealt with at a later time. It never has been adequately dealt with in the 20 years since. And issues relating to the past and suffering of victims and continuing demands for investigations into different atrocities, I think has continued to affect the implementation of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement right up to the present day. In the case of Colombia, victims were put at the heart of the negotiations. One of the 6 agenda points which had to be negotiated was victims. The transitional justice arrangements were constructed around the needs of victims. Victims were brought to Havana to participate in the talks, and the talks resulted in, for example, significant commitments in relation to a reparation package for the victims of the conflict. Which is better? In the case of Colombia, I think it's probably too early to say because there's a period of implementation that will have to be undertaken. But certainly as far as the agreement is concerned, I think that it was better to have a very strong element relating to victims in the agreement. Fifth issue that I think has to be considered is implementation. I've never experienced childbirth for obvious reasons, but I think in many ways I think that the peace agreements are a bit like that. The birth is the big moment we all remember, signing of the agreement. But you know, the hard work is only starting then. It has to be reared and nurtured and looked after over a very long period of time. And implementation of a peace agreement can sometimes be even more challenging than the negotiation itself. In both the Northern Ireland and the Colombian peace agreements, significant attention, I think, was given to implementation, to putting in place implementation bodies, to putting in place ways in which aspects of the agreement could be brought forward. In the case of Northern Ireland, I think the significant role undertaken by the two governments, the government of the United Kingdom and of Ireland, as guarantors of the agreement, I think has provided a ballast for the operation of the agreement in the intervening 20 years. Similarly, in the case of the Colombian agreement, there have been quite detailed arrangements laid out for implementation, in fact, an entire chapter of the agreement. But I think there are probably two, and this comes from a discussion that I had in a conference elsewhere, reflecting, I think, on the Colombian agreement. Two areas, for example, that I would certainly advise if there were people undertaking a peace agreement again. And one is perhaps to put in place some kind of parallel process during the negotiation stage to look at implementation and to involve in that parallel process those who are responsible for the implementation. Those who are responsible, for example, for the implementation of security elements of the agreement, and I think also those who are responsible at a local or regional government level for the implementation. I think that would probably be an improvement. The sixth area is in relation to international support. As Ambassador Mulhall said, the Good Friday Agreement could not have been made. That agreement could not have, talks could not have happened, agreement could not have been made without the support of our international friends, the support of the government, successive presidents of the United States, and the support of the European Union. In part of that support from the United States, there was the active support, as I mentioned earlier, of the Irish diaspora. In the case of the European Union, because I think it's not often referred to about the contribution that it made to the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, it was first of all the space that it created for the improvement of relations between Britain and Ireland. Ireland and the United Kingdom joined the European Union, or the European Community as it was then called, in 1973, less than a year after an angry crowd in Dublin had burned down the British Embassy following the killing of unarmed protesters in Derry on Bloody Sunday. And it is remarkable how the working together in the European Union, Irish and British ministers and Irish and British officials were able to find common ground across a range of issues, which in turn facilitated the kind of informal discussions between the two governments that led to the joint approach to dealing with Northern Ireland that the ambassador referred to earlier. And secondly, I think it is significant that the fact that both states were members of the European Union at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, that many of the compromises which had to be made were made. On the issue of national identity, for example, at the heart of the entire conflict. You know, you can be British, I can be Irish, we're both European. In terms of practical issues like agriculture or fisheries or tourism, economic issues, so much of which was regulated on a common basis. We're all part of the same market, same customs union, and so on. I don't believe that the Good Friday Agreement could have been made, certainly not as it was made, without both states having been members of the European Union together at that time. And of course, since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, the European Union has contributed very significantly financially to the building of peace in Northern Ireland. We are now on our fourth EU peace funding programme in Northern Ireland, a total of 1.5 billion euros contributed by the European Union to the building of peace in Northern Ireland. We are also contributing financially to the building of peace in Colombia. European Union and its member states collectively, and Ireland is one of the member states involved, have contributed something like 1.2 billion euros for peace-building projects in Colombia since the beginning of this century. Among those, for example, were the bottom-up peace laboratories projects, which I think helped to create a foundation for the building of peace. And that work is continuing. There's currently an EU package of about 600 million euros for the supporting of the peace process. But international support is about more than finance. It's about also the political and diplomatic support which countries and international institutions provide for peace. The work, for example, that the United Nations is doing in Colombia at present, the success of the United Nations monitoring and verification mission on the disarmament phase, the fact that Colombia achieved the disarmament of FARC in a period of 7 months. It took 7 years for the IRA to decommission its weapons in Northern Ireland. The continuing work of the UN in its current monitoring mission, the work of the European Union, the United States, the work of countries like Canada, Norway, Cuba, Switzerland, many countries who are contributing to the supporting of building a peace in Colombia. And I believe that international support will be very important over the course of the next number of months and the next couple of years, the period ahead, as a new government takes office in Colombia. There are, as I said, many lessons that can be learned from both processes. But thinking about how best to contribute to a strategy for peace building for the future, probably the best strategy is to prevent conflicts from occurring in the first place. And the Secretary General of the UN, Secretary General Guterres, has put a lot of emphasis on prevention work. That prevention work is not just about new conflicts, it's also about preventing older conflicts from recurring. And that's why, for example, in the context of Colombia, work on the reincorporation of former combatants, and in the case both of Colombia and of Northern Ireland, the critical work of reconciliation, of building bridges between those who had been engaged in the conflict, of addressing the causes of the conflict, whether that is land reform or illicit drugs in Colombia or the sectarian divisions in Northern Ireland, which unfortunately continue to exist. And of course, generally addressing the causes of conflict, the issues of poverty, of exclusion, issues related indeed to climate. And I think if one wants to find a charter of prevention in relation to conflict, of peace building by way of prevention, I think we need look no further than the Sustainable Development Goals, for which Ambassador Donohue again deserves great credit because he was responsible for the chairing of those discussions in the United Nations. 2 months ago, as I said, in Belfast, as we do when we talk about conflicts and we talk about peace, we tend to turn to our poets and writers and musicians. And in Belfast, we quoted a lot of the poetry of Seamus Heaney and listened to a lot of the lyrics of songwriter Paul Brady. I heard U2, great concert in Bogota in October, and at the end of that concert, which had itself a peace theme, Bono made the remark that peace is not a dream, it's an action. But I really don't want to finish quoting an Irish musician or a poet or whatever. So let me turn to the great Colombian Nobel laureate, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The heart's memory eliminates the bad and magnifies the good. And thanks to this artifice, we manage to endure the burden of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gilmore. That was delightful. So I would like to introduce our panel to take the stage, and Amanda Sloat, we're honored to have as our moderator. She will introduce the panelists. She's the non-resident fellow at the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, but most prominently is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute. Her areas of expertise include Turkey and Southern Europe, British politics, the European Union's foreign policy, and transatlantic relations. She served in the U.S. government for nearly a decade. She was most recently Deputy Assistant Secretary for Southern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean Affairs at the State Department. She holds a doctorate in politics from the University of Edinburgh and a bachelor's in political theory from James Madison College at Michigan State University. So I'll hand things over to Amanda, and we will remove our podium and begin our panel. So if the panelists would take the stage.
Welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I am particularly pleased as a Michigan State graduate that Notre Dame did not hold that against me in terms of inviting me to chair today's event. I think it's particularly appropriate that we are holding a session on conflict resolution and peace building on a day when I'm sure all of us woke up to TV and newspapers filled of photos of President Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. And I think it will certainly be very interesting in the days and weeks to come to see what ends up happening with what's been a very long-standing area of tension between the United States, the international community, and North Korea. We have about 45 minutes for our discussion with a very distinguished panel. I think all of you have the bios on your papers, so I will not take up too much time by reading all of those. But we're happy to be joined by Ambassador Camilo Reyes, the ambassador for Colombia, David Cortright, who's the director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame, Norman Houston, who's the director of the Northern Ireland Bureau here in Washington, and Ambassador Barbara Stephenson, who's currently the president of AFSA, the former consul general to Northern Ireland, as well as former ambassador to Panama. So what I would like to do is drill down on some of, I think, what are the really important and essential items that Mr. Gilmore raised in his very rich keynote address. I think we could spend all day here discussing the pieces of that. So I want to tease out some of those elements with members of the panel. And perhaps, Ambassador Reyes, we can start with you. We're now approaching the 2-year anniversary of the agreement in Colombia. So perhaps you can start by sharing with us a little bit about what the government's assessment of the status is, how the government has been seeking to engage with the citizens on this, and then pulling out on some of Mr. Gilmore's remarks on the challenges of implementation, your assessment of the strengths and the remaining challenges of where that process is right now.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to have this opportunity. And I want to thank the Kroc Institute, obviously the University of Notre Dame, and the Keough School. First of all, I think that we have to have in mind that out of 3 stages of the peace agreement, when we put this in a big framework, DDR, demobilization took place in a very successful way. Disarmament took place, as it was recently mentioned by the minister, in a surprisingly successful way. And now we are in the reintegration stage. We know very well, we knew since the negotiations started, and one understands when you look carefully at the text of the agreement, that reintegration is the hardest, the longest, the most demanding, the biggest challenge in any peace agreement. So reintegration and implementation, we know that will take a lot of human resources, a lot of financial resources, and very specifically, lots of political resources. And I, as a Colombian, I just pray to God that we will be able of being persistent It would be so irresponsible, after achieving what we already achieved, now to leave the peace agreement by itself. Just let me add one thing. All the expressions of violence in Colombia, starting with homicides, going through kidnappings, forced recruitment, use of landmines, extortion, all the expressions of the Colombian conflict, which took 52 years, came dramatically down during the last 14 months. And any kind of measurement shows that not only lives have been saved, but that there is a new country and that there are new territories in which we finally can call ourselves Colombia. So, what I want to say is that we have to be able of persisting. The other thing I would like to add is that the peace agreement that was negotiated in Colombia is something that is extremely ambitious because it somehow took in parts of our history which were already in depth with our population. We had a very violent history since the conquest, during the independence, and then the building of our nation was done with enormous efforts. We had all the 19th century was spent in 9 civil wars and 42 or 44 regional conflicts. And we began the 20th century with a huge civil war. It was called La Guerra de los Mil Días. So when you look at the peace process, it is true that it is an agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC, but it represents a much heavier weight that comes from history, that comes from even the founding of our nation. So I think that we have not only the challenge of being persistent, of not letting the enormous conquests achieved losing or simply leaving that enormous, significant historical effort aside. But then we now have another challenge, and that is to be able of pushing together our agenda for peace with our agenda for development, because they are related. And here I would like to add 2 things. An enormous effort has been done if you think in the longer term. An enormous effort has been done regarding education and infrastructure. And I would like to mention that if we manage to keep that, education, infrastructure, and I would like to add one thing, and I'll leave it there for the moment. Education, infrastructure, and diplomacy. We need to keep the effort so that the international community keeps on backing our peace process. And it is not only our peace process, it's backing Colombia. I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador. David, why don't we turn to you? The Kroc Institute has been given a unique responsibility written into the agreement in terms of the technical verification and monitoring of the implementation of the agreement, which, as Minister Gilmore spoke to and the Ambassador alluded to, is an essential part of making a peace agreement work. Perhaps you could give a few brief words about how that came about. And then I know you also just recently returned from Colombia, and we're looking forward to the assessment report that you'll be producing in the next couple of weeks about the status of implementation. So maybe you can give us a sneak preview of what's in your report.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Embassy of Ireland for hosting this event, and thank you, Mr. Gilmore, for that very eloquent and incisive set of comments. Just come back from Bogota, as you mentioned, and those of you who've been there many times know that it's often cloudy, and in a way there's a cloud over the peace agreement. I mean, it's quite amazing how much pessimism there is. And I can't tell the number of times when reporters or experts have asked me, well, when do you expect the demise or the collapse of the peace agreement? Or if you read the New York Times, there are stories that it's about to collapse at any moment. But in fact, we're finding that while there are many problems, as there always are in peace processes, there's been significant progress. Our methodology is, we describe it a bit in the handout, but we've tracked these 6 chapters into 18 themes and 70-some sub-themes, and we follow them very meticulously. And we're finding that there has been steady progress in the implementation of most of the provisions of the accord. More than 50% of the agreement now has at least some progress toward implementation, as has been mentioned. Particularly in the short-term measures around ceasefire, demobilization, disarmament has been quite remarkable. And that's often the case and is really the necessary first step. The hard businesses now, as you mentioned, Ambassador, long-term development, the reincorporation, land reform, the substitution of the illicit crops. These are measures that are going to take many years, probably decades, to really implement fully. So the agreement will become more and more a process of enhancing the overall governance and the presence of the state in Colombia. So we see that it's actually reasonably well, and if we compare the progress in Colombia to the 34 other comprehensive peace agreements that are in our peace accords matrix, Colombia's doing okay. It's on track, if it stays on track, to be successfully implemented. But we also know that no agreement is completely implemented. Even the Ireland Accord, at one point we gave it a 90% rating. Of course, that was before the latest breakdown at Stormont. But it reflects the fact that you can expect reversals, setbacks. They always occur. And I think in Colombia, we may be at a point where there will be some significant setbacks coming up. We know with new government will be coming in, and the leading candidate, the party has expressed some real skepticism about the transitional justice mechanisms, the HEP, and so perhaps we'll see some changes there. And also, we know that while the overall level of violence is reduced, and as you said very importantly, there are thousands of people alive today in Colombia who might not otherwise have been if the war had continued at the previous pace. That's a fundamental achievement. On the other hand, there are more than 100, the numbers are maybe a couple hundred people have been killed in the territories. Assassinations and attacks are continuing by a toxic mix of different kinds of armed groups. And while the government has made significant efforts to try to address the security issues, substantial forces are being deployed. Plan Ores has been created. The Corpe Elite and other special bodies have been created. We still haven't been able to really get the protection down to the community level where it's necessary. And that's a huge challenge for any security force. Northern Ireland has been dealing with this, and through the integration of the police forces, has developed a community policing idea that's helping to reduce violence. But it's much more difficult in the rural areas and very remote areas where the violence is occurring. So these are real challenges, but nonetheless, I think we see overall progress, and it's really important to continue, be persistent, to be patient, and to recognize that the peace implementation, our methodology tracks over 10 years, and really the plan Marco that the government has established for the time frame is 15 years, but really we're talking decades before the whole process will unfold. And when we get to the fundamental issues of reconciliation of parties and communities being able to live together, that's an unending process. It always is something that we have to pay attention to. And last point being that there's a tremendous civil society mobilization in Colombia, as it has been in Northern Ireland. And that's an important benefit and force that can continue and build support for the implementation going forward.
Thank you. Norman, let's turn to you and drill down a little bit on where things are in Northern Ireland. I was there last month, and it was the first time in several years I had been there, and was struck by a couple things that Minister Gilmore had referred to. One is the level of economic prosperity that Belfast has enjoyed in terms of a lot of the development in the city centre, the Titanic corridor, but at the same time, a degree of pessimism there as well, with Brexit seeming to bring back a lot of these old identity questions that people had been able to ignore for the last 20 years or so. So talk to us a little bit from your perspective about where you see things with a much more mature peace agreement 20 years on. But also, as Minister Gilmore said, an agreement that worked because both countries were members of the European Union, and now the destabilizing effect that Brexit is having on the process there.
Well, thank you, Amanda. I think that Mr. Gilmore covered the whole issue of the Northern Ireland peace process very eloquently, and he did draw on the fact that 20 years after the signing of the agreement, we don't have a working executive in Northern Ireland, which is a great pity, particularly for me, because I would represent it if it were up and operating. But I think we need to see it in the overall context, and I think that Mr. Gilmore pointed that out. Northern Ireland is a completely different place now than it was in 1998. The absence of violence, which Ambassador Reyes has referred to, makes a tremendous difference to the opportunity for economic development. I mean, if you look at Northern Ireland over the past 2 decades since the signing of the agreement, we've had more inward investment into Northern Ireland than we've had in our entire history as a region or a state, or whatever way you want to define us. Tourism has gone through the roof, and I imagine in the presence of peace in Colombia, the opportunities for tourism in your beautiful country are enormous. So there are many things that are good about the process. The lack of a working executive is personally very sad for me, because from 2007 to the beginning of 2017, just over 10 years, we had the longest period of continuous local government that we have ever had since 1972, when the old Belfast Parliament was prorogued. And there certainly doesn't seem to be at this stage any real enthusiasm for the two main parties going into government together again. And Brexit has to be one of the main causes of that. I mean, Amanda has very eloquently also said being part of the European Union, and Ambassador Mulhall brought it up as well, gave us all a feeling that we were all part of the one big group. And the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union will, of course, have major issues for Northern Ireland. I mean, all the Northern Ireland parties want a soft border. Nobody in any way is advocating we should have a harsh border. Unfortunately, the fine words about having an open border and implementing it are two entirely different things. And I think people with bigger brains than mine are trying to struggle with how you make that work. I think what the Good Friday Agreement did for many people, and Mr. Gilmore mentioned it, you could be Irish or you could be British, and it didn't really matter in the wider sense. The fact that we had a mandatory coalition meant that every shade of political opinion in Northern Ireland was represented in government. And I think that was very, very important for the people of Northern Ireland. I'm probably less pessimistic than most people that I deal with in Washington are over the Northern Ireland situation vis-a-vis Brexit. I think people are so committed to the peace process in Northern Ireland that I think we will end up with some fudge, or whatever you want to call it, that will keep the border fluid. I just want to say 2 very quick things about the Colombian experience. Northern Ireland has been very privileged to be of some support to the Colombian government, and you can never take one peace process and put it down on another and say it works perfectly, because obviously it doesn't. They're all unique. But way back in 2012, a group of Northern Ireland politicians from all over the political spectrum went to Colombia to meet not only President Santos, but members of civil society. And their biggest message was ceasefire had to come first, that no negotiation could work without that. And we were very pleased in November 2016 when President Santos made a state visit to the United Kingdom. The only other region he went outside London was to Northern Ireland. And I think he did say very eloquently himself, what struck him so much was the absence of violence and the difference it had made to the economy. And I think everyone in Northern Ireland sees the benefit of the new Northern Ireland that Mr. Gilmore referred to. We don't have the security, we don't have all those sorts of things, but we still have a very divided community. And I think that the Brexit issue has really bubbled to the surface again, issues which we had hoped had gone away.
Well, Barbara, let me turn to you. I tell the story every time I see her. I met Ambassador Stephenson a week after I moved to Belfast. I moved there right before 9/11. And I have to say, as an American, it was very poignant to experience the Northern Ireland attacks from Belfast. And I saw Ambassador Stephenson speak at a memorial service that was held on the Friday after the attacks, flanked by the leaders of the Unionists and the nationalist communities. And she said, the thing you can do to most help us is to find peace amongst yourselves. And that line has stayed with me ever since, because I thought it was a really poignant reminder of the way we're all connected and the way that there is a need for international support for these agreements. So I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit, both from your experiences in Northern Ireland, also your time in Latin America, about the importance of the international community in these processes. And also wanted to ask, there's been lots of references by the other panels to the remaining challenges with security and with DDR. And also, given your experiences with police in both of these places, if you could talk a little bit about how we address some of those challenges on the security front.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks for that reminder of all gathering. I've often said, 9/11 was not news any American ever wanted to hear, but there was no better place in the whole world to be an American than to be in Northern Ireland, and to be so kind of picked up and embraced, and watching thousands of people just fill the streets in front of Belfast City Hall to kind of mark the ties that bind and to mark our shared loss. I think I made those remarks on the same spot, pretty much roughly where President Clinton kicked the whole thing off, which was lighting the Christmas tree in front of Belfast City Hall. And he made remarks that were sort of our watchword at the consulate. It was, if the people of Northern Ireland are willing to take risks for peace, the people of the United States will stand with you. And it was really what motivated us during my whole time there, is that we had an obligation now that people had taken risks for peace. Because that's what peace agreements are about, right? Is that the hard men basically get to set the terms for laying down their arms and making themselves vulnerable, and then the rest of us have to raise the baby and to get the institutions to work right, so that the exhaustion that we all have with the carnage of an ongoing conflict, which makes us so hunger for peace, survives that transition. Because once peace has happened for a while, what do we all want? Justice. And this is what peace agreements really, this is the difficulty of keeping optimism as the burning desire for peace subsides, and what moves into the forefront is justice. And why is it that my sister is dead and you, who are responsible for killing her, are still celebrating family birthdays? This is, I think, a common factor as we look at lessons learned. And it's been hard, it's hard in every peace deal. So President Clinton on the tree lighting, the American role, George Mitchell's legendary role, Congress, we've had a little reference to the Four Horsemen, Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, Chris Dodd. They played huge roles in supporting this. I'm going to, though, quote one of my SDLP friends from after I left. What is it that the Americans brought to the peace process? Optimism, he said. This sense of optimism that this can work, that we can find a way, that we can solve the next set of problems. That was one of the most important American gifts, because our role is not a formal guarantor like Ireland's and the United Kingdom's. It's a different role. It's an emotional role born of the diaspora of 40 million Americans who self-identify as Irish, and a sense that all cannot be right here unless all is right in Ireland. It's a very kind of deep emotional feeling. So I think our role was cheerleader. It was bringer of optimism. It was a very practical role in George Mitchell's legendary contribution to brokering the peace agreement. But I also want to talk about institutional reform and the Patton Report and police reform, because it's less sung, and I think it is absolutely one of the best practices and one of the lessons we can learn from the Northern Ireland peace process, because I think we got police reform right there. I also am a veteran of the El Salvador peace process, and we dissolved the security forces per the peace agreement at exactly the same time that we started to deport gang members from Los Angeles, and never really recovered law and order in the streets of El Salvador, something I regret to this day. There was never a breakdown of law and order in Northern Ireland as that transition from a paramilitary anti-terrorism Royal Ulster Constabulary, unacceptable to the Catholic nationalist minority, transformed into a police service of Northern Ireland, which every day had more Catholic nationalist members. Law and order remained there, and that is one of the most important guarantors of human rights, is to have a functioning police force. So I think this is one of the big success stories. It's not nearly as emotionally, it's not as high profile and it's emotionally tugging at your heart, but 177 or so recommendations in the Patton report. And then bureaucratically, what would happen is sort of 6 weeks before the international observers were coming back to check in on progress on police reform, you'd watch all your police friends drop whatever else they were doing, pull that reform list from the bottom of their inboxes, and start to actually tick off the hard work so they could report progress under the next bit of international oversight and the report. And that is how, without a lot of drama, there was a major transformation of an institution that I believe in many ways was at the very heart of the conflict, was that the Catholic nationalist community did not necessarily accept the Crown Justice as administered by the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Remove that from it and make it a guarantor of citizen safety. And you know what? You will have problems. You won't get the devolved government back up. But I used to tell every consul general that would come along, and we would get all pessimistic about where we are today. Folks, the day that what we're talking about is the budget and how to distribute limited funds, we have succeeded. We are not talking about Bloody Sunday or Armagh or a bombing anymore. This is what peace looks like. So I end with what the Americans brought was a commitment. We would be an honest broker. We would stand with you. We would oversee some of the tedious bureaucratic processes, and we would bring our legendary optimism to bear to keep the thing going through the dark days. That's the role of the Americans.
I feel better just hearing all of that. Minister Gilmore, let me turn to you and give you the chance to respond to anything the panelists said, and also you quoted Bono and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I thought of a quote from Star Trek, which is the line that things are only impossible until they're not. And I'm interested in your experiences in Colombia and Northern Ireland. What you thought were the most impossible things, and what finally prompted those to change, and what lessons we can take from that.
Yeah, well, following on from Ambassador Stephenson, because I think that, yes, you're absolutely right. The American contribution to Northern Ireland was that sense of optimism. And I think of that often, in fact, because I think that is what the international community generally, for example, can bring to the Colombian peace process, because I very often hear, people in Colombia who, they look at the things that are not being done, or some of the failures or things that are not happening, and start to talk about, the peace agreement is failing. It's not failing. There are just things that have not been done yet, and maybe some of those things need to be done faster. Reincorporation, for example. I think we need to do more, and I think we need to move on that much more quickly. I think one of the other things that you talk about things that are impossible, and I'm conscious I don't want to get involved. There's a presidential election in Colombia on Sunday, and I don't want to get involved in the political discussion before that. But thinking back on Northern Ireland, one of the things that we thought was impossible was that Ian Paisley would support the building of peace in Northern Ireland and would support the implementation of the agreements. He opposed the negotiations. He opposed the agreement when it was announced. His famous phrase was never, never, never. And he ended up, and watched the movie. There's a movie made of it. And sometimes people in Colombia ask me about the movie, and they see Martin McGuinness, and they see this, and they think, well, that's Timoshenko and that's Santos. And I tell them, no. That's Timoshenko, and that's Uribe. Paisley was such a strong opponent of the agreement, and he and his party came round to supporting it and to working together with the nationalist parties in making the agreement. That was something that we thought was impossible, and it happened.
Well, I have a whole list of questions, but let me turn to the audience and see if this discussion has prompted anything that any of you want to ask. Yeah, here in the front. And let's, in the interest of time, take a couple. So we have you in the front, and then we have you over there. So can we get a mic for this woman here? And if you could introduce yourself, be brief, and a question.
No problem. Lisa Buckner, Embassy of Ireland. I was wondering, Colombia is currently in phase 3 of preliminary examinations at the ICC. Is there concern at all for the prospects of a formal investigation that would somehow disrupt the peace process or disrupt the delicate balance of peace versus justice that exists in communities transitioning out of conflict? Or are people involved in the peace process very much hopeful for the court's intervention?
Let's take the second question here in the front.
David Donohue. Just a couple of reflections, if I may, Amanda, from the fantastic presentations we've had this morning. Just number one, arising from something Norman said about how a ceasefire has to come first. I obviously strongly agree, but I wanted to say that that was really the basis on which the Irish government and the British government approached the whole peace process in Northern Ireland. We had to get the ceasefire, the IRA ceasefire first, and that meant both private contacts but also public, or at least public documents being agreed among ourselves, which would in effect be a kind of incentive for the IRA to actually enter or for their political representatives to enter a negotiation process at the end of the day. So we reckon that the only way to establish lasting peace in Northern Ireland would be to play the extremes back into the centre, and that inclusive approach has actually worked. But it meant in turn that we had to be extremely vigilant about about people sticking to the commitment not to use violence. So, as Barbara perhaps will remember and others, there were times when we had the negotiations interrupted for a week or two while a party which had been associated with a paramilitary attack outside in the real world, as it were, was examined for whether it was still compliant with the principle of non-violence. So we paid a certain price in terms of loss of momentum in order to keep everybody within the tent. A point then from Barbara about the American process, or the American involvement. I should add that in addition to optimism, that particular administration managed to build a remarkable degree of trust on both sides. And that was the first administration which had achieved that. There wasn't much point having an American administration which was only attractive to one side of the community. The Clinton administration pulled off quite a stroke by being able to appeal to both. And then finally, Eamon was talking about Ian Paisley. I mean, I suppose the price we all had to pay to get the DUP on board eventually was that, in effect, another agreement, the St. Andrews Agreement, coming a few years later, had to be tacked on in order to give Paisley and his party a sense that they had somehow renegotiated the Good Friday Agreement. I hope some of that is relevant to Colombia as well. I think it is. But the notion of, in effect, follow-up agreements which save the blushes for those who are not completely on board at the beginning, that may be relevant in Colombia. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we had one more question over here.
Hi, my name is Katie Smith, and I'm with Search for Common Ground, and I'm also a former Notre Dame grad. And so I just wanted to say thank you for hosting this really great panel discussion. And I wanted to thank also the comments that were focusing on prevention, as well as the need for sustained effort in the implementation process. But something I didn't hear a lot about discussed is the need to prepare communities at the local level for peace, because what we're seeing in some of the conflicts around the world right now, such as in Yemen and in South Sudan, is that while negotiations are happening at the highest level, communities are actually taking on those national dynamics and entrenching those within their own communities and making violence more persistent and entrenched. And so I just wanted to know, from your perspectives and your experience both in Northern Ireland and Colombia, what programmatic and diplomatic initiatives or actions would you recommend to build constituencies for peace at the local level, so that there is a country left to implement the peace agreement when it's signed? Thank you.
Great. So excellent questions and observations. Who on the panel would like to jump in on any of those? Should we, Ambassador, start with you on the end?
Yes. Well, let me comment first on the ICC question. I think it is very interesting to have in mind that the ICC was always by the process in which the special justice system was built. And they visited us, and they did contributed to the process in which we arrived to a system that would be specially built for the peace agreement and for the guerrillas and then the military who committed crimes during the 53 years of war. What I want to say is that they said, and there was a visit by the Attorney General of the ICC system. She came and she said, we agree with the system you've built and we are backing it. So what we should expect is that once the whole system starts, and it just started working and considering specific cases of people responsible of crimes during the conflict, that the whole system will be working according to our membership of the ICC and of the Treaty of Rome. That is what we think will happen, and that is the way it was built.
David, I know you had a reaction on that too.
A quick comment on that. That's exactly right, and I think that the ICC has been watching, but accepting. And this is where, if there is to be a change in the HEP with the new government, it needs to be done very carefully so as to not trigger an ICC intervention, because that could be risky. I think on the question of local involvement, as you know, the Accord has many provisions to encourage citizen participation to enhance the quality of democracy, and that has included efforts to really mobilize people to play a role in the various dimensions, everything from the crop substitution to the local economic development plans. And the church, the Catholic Church, the social pastorate of the Bishops' Conference has been playing a big role on that, and other NGOs. And this is where the attacks that have been occurring, unfortunately, have been often against those very social leaders or human rights defenders who have been trying to advocate for the process, who have been mobilizing local communities to participate. So it sort of emphasizes the importance of getting that security question better and improve our community protection measures there.
Amanda, may I add something?
Of course, Ambassador.
I would like to add to that I think we have to recognize that there are two big challenges for Colombia regarding the implementation of the peace agreement. There are not only challenges regarding the implementation of the peace agreement, but regarding the future of Colombia. And those two big challenges are the drug problem, which is fueling other organized crime expressions, and Venezuela. And I am sorry to mention that because I am an optimist. And I've seen an extremely positive development of my country during the last 10, 15 years. Extremely positive. But the fact is that we cannot ignore those two factors. The drug problem, the way in which we have to face the drug problem, having always in mind the shared responsibility approach to it, and Venezuela. And so, again, I go back to the enormous importance of the international community and the capacity of the states of working together, in this case, especially the region and the sub-region. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the working with local communities, I think, is critically important, and we saw that in Northern Ireland. In some respects, communities, civil society, is actually ahead of the negotiators of a peace agreement. I mean, in Northern Ireland, there was demand for peace from people. But there are also issues in the case of Northern Ireland. This is a divided society. The national identities, religious identities, and those divisions are still there. Even 20 years later, there are something like 50 so-called peace walls in Belfast. So there is a lot to be done on reconciliation and on building bridges and getting people to work together. In the case of Colombia, one of the initiatives that the European Union supported back over the years were the so-called peace laboratories. And we were, Father Pacho Giroux, who will now head the Truth Commission, was one of the people who encouraged us to become involved in the peace laboratories, which was about working with communities at ground level. But there are issues on the ground with communities which I think have to be addressed. If you can kind of picture the scene, some of the areas which have been affected by the conflict, they were controlled by FARC. FARC was the law and order. They ran the business, they provided the security and so on. Then FARC go. And there is a vacuum. Arising from that situation, you have new armed groups emerging, battling for control of the drugs trade, and that's one of the current drivers of violence in Colombia. You have, in addition to that, you have people who are trying to make the peace agreement work. For example, on crop substitution. The government sends its people out, they have a meeting of growers, people say, yes, we will go with the crop substitution program. Then it moves to the individual grower. And the individual grower is being intimidated by the armed actors and people who are trying to provide leadership. When you talk, for example, about the numbers, David, as you did, and rightly, numbers of social leaders, human rights defenders who have been killed in Colombia since the beginning of the agreement, these are the people who are trying to provide leadership to make crop substitution work, and they are then targeted by the armed groups. So I think that this is an area I think that we're going to have to give much more attention to ensure that there is security for people on the ground and that the implementation of the parts of the agreement that relate to rural development, relate to crop substitution and to the to dealing with the illegal drugs trade, that they actually succeed.
Can I just come in on the young lady's question about the Northern Ireland and the civil society thing? And I have worked with Search for Common Ground before, and I've really enjoyed the work with them. I mean, we have been very lucky too. We talked about earlier the EU money, the 1.5 billion euros, which have gone into supporting projects, not only in Northern Ireland, but in the 6 border counties. But we've also got a very large amount of money from the International Fund for Ireland, since 1996, I think, when it was started up. And I see Brett Dorvac sitting there from State Department, who very kindly administers it for us. I mean, over $540 million of American taxpayers' money has gone into supporting projects on the ground in Northern Ireland, which are specifically aimed at grassroots groups. And they cover everything from trying to get the peace walls down, the communities to take the peace walls away, to training. We've had a lot of work where young people from Northern Ireland, from very disadvantaged backgrounds, have come on training courses to the United States under the Wider Horizons programme. So there's been a whole level of involvement at that level. And earlier, Mr. Gilmore talked about the role of women in the Women's Coalition. There's a great documentary out at the minute called Say Goodbye to Dinosaurs. And it's actually the story of the women's movement during the peace process and how difficult it was for them to get any sort of be seen or even allowed to speak in some cases. But they were grassroots people, and they were very much in contact with their own community. So I can't overemphasize how important it is in that respect. During St. Patrick's Day, through the help of the American Consulate General in Belfast, they brought in a number of civil society people, community workers, because we didn't have a government, so there was no one else to bring really. But these people were brilliant, and their mantra the entire time was, we want things to move forward. They were very forward-thinking, they were very inclusive, and they were giving a very different story about what was happening in Northern Ireland. And we have pushed that a tremendous amount, but we've been able to do it because of the International Fund for Ireland, the EU peace building, and basically Irish America reaching out and giving these people an opportunity.
So on communities, I do think it's true in Northern Ireland, particularly that sometimes the leadership was coming from below. And actually, because the way the Good Friday Agreement is structured, which is a whole other panel, sometimes the citizens are more forward-leaning about reconciliation and shared future than people who are elected on sectarian tickets are. Let me leave it there. So I think part of it is incumbent upon those of us who have things like the White House and St. Patrick's Day. So as Consul General, we started reaching down into community leaders during my time in Belfast. That's when we first did this. And we did have a functioning government, but we said, we're not sure that the political leaders that we're celebrating are actually leading the next steps in peace. This is happening on the ground, block by block, community organization by community organization. So that's who we brought to the White House. And I will tell you what, when they went home, they were much higher profile. Their voices were heard. They got chances to speak on the radio. President Bush singled out Mary, whose last name I'm not going to remember, who came over. Her husband's van had been firebombed, and because he was handicapped, and the lift that put his wheelchair in was destroyed, and it was destroyed by IRA activists who wanted to threaten Catholics who joined the new policing order. And Mary went on the radio the next day and said, "We will not be cowed like this. This is our country. We will step up, much like your Colombian heroes who are being threatened." And so she got to come to the White House, and President Bush talked about, this is the answer. This is what you say to this kind of thuggery and terrorism. She went home. Mary had quite a voice. She was an inspiring figure. So you can do things when you have access like embassies and the White House and profiles. It is really important to think creatively about how you can reduce the risk, not just as a security solution, but I have to tell you, you'd have thought twice about going after Mary again. Because Mary had a platform and she was going to talk about thuggery, and you were going to pay a big price for going after her. So there are very creative ways other than just surrounding people by bodyguards that I think actually raises their voices, and it's really worth thinking creatively about because it'll change the game on the ground. Political leaders, elected politicians will follow the leadership of people like Mary if you give them enough of a voice.
So we are rapidly running out of time, and I do not want to prevent anybody who might be planning to join the Capitol's parade that is going to be passing near here. I don't know if anybody has a burning question that you will feel your day is unfulfilled if you don't get to ask. I do have one very brief question to wrap up, and then we're going to do 30 seconds for each of you with final words. I couldn't help but think in comparing the two cases that there may be lessons to learn about the wisdoms of holding referenda. And what this means about the prospect of direct democracy. So 30 seconds, I will either let you answer that question, or if you feel that it's politically too sensitive for you, if there are any other final words that you want to leave this audience with. We will go in reverse order, so we will start with you.
It's interesting you mentioned the referendum because during the negotiations we were constantly consulting with the different bodies that were in Havana, and they asked about the different procedures for democratic approval. And we said, well, we would be very cautious about the referendum route because in other agreements it's failed. And you can get political support through congressional and political means. So in that case, and this was from the record of our look at the other comprehensive agreements. But I especially like, Ambassador, your idea about for going forward, the civil society, the citizen groups that can play a critical role in finding creative ways to empower them, not only protect them, is really an important route.
Ireland has a lot of experience of referenda. We have to have referenda on European Union every time the treaty changes. We have referendum on lots of delicate. We've just had one. And I think the first thing to recognize about referenda, and I'm a great believer in referenda, people get a direct say, but they're very different to elections. And very often people who vote in referenda are not necessarily voting about the question on the paper. My old press officer used to say, no matter what you have a referendum on, 1/3 of the people will vote against it. And there was a practical example of that. When we had to accede to the International Criminal Court, we had to have a referendum. And he was right. 1/3 of the voters voted against it. And you wonder, why did this happen? I think the referendum, look, the referendum on the Colombian peace agreement was, at the end of the day, was essentially 50-50. But I think the overwhelming majority of people in Colombia are for peace. I mean, there's no, including people who voted against it. And I think, where we are now, new president will be elected on Sunday. We're not back in October 2016 anymore. We are where we are, and it's now about building on what has already been achieved and working forward and being positive about it.
Barbara?
I think I, too, have become very skeptical of the value of referendums in making societies better. I think I would end with peace agreements are always hard, and that we can't be discouraged by what's happening day to day. We have to remember how much better it is to be living in peace and sorting out issues of justice and reintegration than it was to be watching a mom cry, mi niña, because a mortar had gone afoul and blown up her house instead of the police headquarters. That's a personal memory of mine from El Salvador. You never want to go back to those days, so it's worth all the hard work it takes to just sort out the problems and build a new society.
Yeah, well, I'm retiring next year, so I can be a little controversial. I mean, I think a referenda are fine if you know what you're voting for. In the case of the Good Friday Agreement, the citizenry not only of Northern Ireland, but of the Republic of Ireland had a document, so they knew what they were voting on. I think if you're doing a referendum and it's a yes and no, and you're not quite sure if you vote no or yes or whatever, what you're going to end up with. So I think that they have a limited application. But I think it's very important that you know exactly when you tick the box what the consequences are going to be. And thankfully for the Good Friday Agreement, which had a majority in both parts of the island, everybody knew what they were signing up for.
Diplomatically stated. Ambassador, the final word to you.
Yes, well, I would like to say that I think that the political community at the international level and at the national level should think over the referendum figure, the referendum mechanism, simply because I think that the way in which we are dealing today with information regarding our communities has changed so dramatically and so rapidly that we do not understand the real challenge that it represents. So I think we are betting with an old idea on an old mechanism that is no longer the same.
Well, thank you very much to my distinguished panelists. Thank you to the Irish Embassy, to Notre Dame for hosting today's event, and most of all, thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you.